Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you live around the world. We're back once again looking at the hubs and the options and considerations for each of the hub types. The opinion that I offered in the previous video about the strength of the plates or the star hubs may have been a little bit hyperbolic, but I think in the way I was contemplating, it wouldn't have been far away from the truth. In that I said if you put a plate top and bottom, it helps to basically extend the bending moment to the full width of 100 millimeters, which is the depth of the timber that I'll be using. And I said it's probably the stronger version. Well, I would dispel that in one way. This is, without doubt, the strongest hub. It's used by, I think, Viking domes in their large structures, their very large structures, and they make comment that it is the strong, not this particular one I don't think, I'm not too sure where this is from, but the basic design where there's a central tube or hub or component with the wings extended out for the struts, they say is their strongest option. Now, I'm not going to dispute that. Their design and no doubt their engineering is far superior to anything that I'm contemplating. However, the reason I said what I did was these things, these bolts. Now, I like this. This is the domed nut that I was talking about that can actually become part of the aesthetic appeal of a dome, if that's what you like. But the strength that these have would be the limiting factor, not the hub itself. The hub is incredibly strong. The beauty is, in a geodesic dome, as we all know, the energies are dissipated through all the structural members, and the loads probably are quite minimal through the bolts and nuts. So while I'll concede that this is the strongest hub, hence why Viking states it in their documentation and website, I will still contend that what we're doing would be second strongest. But for the application I'm contemplating, I think it's way more than we need to be worried about. In this area here in the top right hand corner, this is where I was contemplating having a heavy plate with the star and the star plate, and having the wings penetrate at the midpoint of the timber. Now, this would be quite a light timber. I'm not too sure what dimension it would be, but you can kind of tell that the heads of the what we call coach bolts are quite small, or seem to be quite small. And the grain size indicates that this is a reasonably small piece of timber. But this was one of the positions I'd mentioned. This is my initially preferred option, but getting the bolts of sufficient length into the hub and into your timber, and this is just a mock-up for someone's made and they've just used very light timber, but to get sufficient bolt length into the timber through the hub becomes problematic. Not impossible, just problematic. Because when we get up in size of the spans of the dome, we want to make sure that our penetration into the end grain of the timber is quite a depth, 150, 200 millimeters or more, and getting the screw the SPAC screw that I keep on referring to, into the hub, and as the hub grows in depth, it becomes potentially harder and harder, and especially the bottom one, because you have to come up at an angle as the struts are angled down, so your penetration becomes, well, angled. If we just imagine that the bottom one here has to come up from an angle, the screw would be scribing a line similar to where my cursor is indicating. The top one is much better. You can probably achieve a long bolt or screw through this position here. But my concern is big structures, not small structures, but big structures, and the, what I term, gloving effect of the wood fibers in the screw threads. Am I overstating the problem? Probably. But I don't want to go down the route of building something and it failing, and then the cost of that is excessive. So this is my original preference because it's just simple. I like any design that's simple has an appeal. This was a option that I hadn't considered before, and I'd only just realised what it was that I was looking at. And I'm going to say it's a dead flat plate, but it's not. I think it's been formed in some way, slightly. I've got the impression that there's a raised point here, but let's just pretend that it is a dead flat plate, which means that you could, if you have the workshop capabilities, cut your struts and angle the landing position on the struts so that they form a dead flat surface. You could, I'm just thinking out aloud now, have it where the struts come together in like you've got the arrow head of the strut, so they all come into a point, and through use of a jig or router create almost like you're going to cut a circle, but you're cutting a flat surface with the router, probably leaving the central piece where your router's pivoting, and then you could just finish that by hand. And then you could bolt flat plates straight through your hubs. The dome is created itself by joining all the struts together, and you could hold or temporary fix them and then install the plate in position, meaning that you've got basically zero tolerance. You've got basically zero tolerance because everything's machined in place, so you don't have to worry about all those angles. This was the options that I was considering, having the star plate. This has got a slightly taper, and this one here they have separate pieces and they're just bolted together, which is fine. This one here, there are three separate strips overlaying each other and then attached through the struts themselves to form the star plate, and likely attached through here. I don't have the detail for that. The problem with that is, in our dome, and this is the thing, you see me referring to lots of the different manufacturers, and at the moment I'm referencing Viking domes. It's not that I'm copying their design, because I don't think their design is unique to that approach. Just like we're seeing here, there's many different approaches, and they don't accommodate what I want to achieve. But I'm looking at their perspectives, their shortcomings, I'm going to say. They probably would feel insulted about that, but in this instance, what I'm referring to here is that these struts would have to be opposite each other for a straight piece of metal to bend across. Otherwise they'd have to have their leg bent in the respective angle, or at the respective angle for this strut as opposing this strut, and they aren't in line. Not in my dome, they're not anyway. And that's the point. I could apply to a company to supply me a plate that works for their dome type, and it would be nothing like what I want to achieve. So, not good. One of the beauties is there's variations of a theme for all of these, and you can use the variations to get your mock-up, and therefore your angles. You could even do a full-size mock-up to get the angles and sizing, and then make a judgment and go from there. And one such version of it is this one here, this photo, and this is what I'd contemplated way back weeks ago, and I'd put it to the back burner just to let it simmer away, and then I came across this photo, which is effectively what I was contemplating, because when you layer your steel sheet or plate, it occupies a different position on the hubs, on the struts rather, and this shows clearly their thinking. So they've got the 5 struts, and each position on each strut drops down to a different position, so that the hubs, sorry, the struts are in their correct orientation to each other. Whereas some of these other versions, they don't cater for that necessarily, and the thickness of the struts themselves, depending on the thickness of the plate being used, or the metal being used, would alter where the struts would land or be positioned. This one negates that. It's a bit clumsy in look, but I feel that, well, A, it works, it would be very strong, and it's quite small, but it accommodates your mock-up and positioning of your plates, your angles between the struts themselves, and would therefore be quite a good approach to finding out the pros and cons of your layout. It may well be sufficient that you just go with this approach, and the bigger the dome size, the less clunky that would be, because relative to the struts themselves, this becomes a lesser and lesser issue. The other thing is, when you come back again to this type of strut and hub design, there's not a lot of, I'm going to suggest, I can't speak on their behalf, but I suggest there's not a lot of thought or requirement for these struts to be at relatively different heights relative to the hub, because as we know through our drawings, to get a geometrically correct orientation of these struts, they are effectively at different heights. Yes, they all come to a center common point at the middle of the hub, but the surfaces are at relatively different heights. I can go back to the star plate, and we'll have a look at this. So we've got the mock-up here, where we've got the 6 struts meeting on and this is representative, it's accurate actually for our hub, for the angles between the struts, but not for the height, because what I've shown here is the hub being created where the struts all meet in a flush position. So that's flush in this point here, or close to it. But in our dome, we know that these come at different heights to each other, and only their geometric center point on the top surface come to a common point. Now, is that necessary in a dome that's going to have a flexible cover? No, definitely not. But were we to create the rigid surfaces, perhaps of plywood or polycarbonate or some such, then yes, that becomes more of an issue. So why build something that won't cater for both situations? Also, if you come to, if these legs are too long, when you come to fixing those rigid surfaces down, and there's a dihedral angle required on top of each strut, this is going to get in the way. The decision-making process requires at least these points to be considered. So you could make this positioned on the bottom. But as I was talking about before, there is a bending or rotation moment or bending moment here at each point. Having a plate top and bottom neutralizes or negates that bending or rotational or movement. But with a dihedral angle requirement, this thing would get in the way because there would be no fixing along the very end of the cladding, the plywood or the polycarbonate. Dropping it down to a level where you could create that, you'd really then have to slot the timber and then fix through the timber. So you're still using two plates, but on the outer plate that would have to be slotted, and the longer you make this leg, the harder it is to get the slot accurate. It's just a construction issue, not really an impediment, but it's just a construction issue. So these considerations all have to be thrown into the mix, so that yes, this is a good idea, but what are the shortcomings? What are the advantages? Where does it have to be positioned? What size bolts? What type of bolts, depending on the type of timber. Not all bolts can be used in all timbers. Corrosion issues. The method, I'll just zoom out for a moment. I'll get rid of this. The idea of running a straight plate from one side to the other is appealing, but it doesn't work here. You can see, especially these two, they're not opposite each other. These two here are definitely not opposite each other either, so our plate can't simply, it's not a strap where we can just run it across. They have their own distinct angles relative to each other. So in short order, you start to see the limitations of a simple design, and why we say we need to build our own variation of the theme. So we're not copying another company's, we're not stepping on the toes of their intellectual property or anything like that. We have got this requirement for this style of dome, for these parameters, a rigid surface, and we need to come up with our own approach to it. Asking a manufacturer to supply something to meet our needs sometimes would be an impossible ask. So hence building via SketchUp prior to physically making the item. Sketchy builder. You've got to know your building process and why I'm choosing to use SketchUp. Okie dokie. That was my ramblings for this morning, Sunday morning, and I will now leave you alone and I'll see you in the next video. Okay, bye.